1940, an American fighter pilot named Hubert Zemke found himself standing on a cold English airfield, staring at a plane that would change his life. He had just flown a P-40 Warhawk across the Atlantic, a machine he knew inside and out, powered by an Allison V-1710 engine that he trusted completely. And then someone handed him the keys to a Spitfire. What happened next would spark one of the most consequential engineering rivalries of the Second World War. This is the story of the Rolls-Royce Merlin engine and how British engineering forced American pilots to demand a different heart for their machines. Along the way, we'll encounter desperate engineers, stubborn bureaucrats, aerial duels that decided the fate of nations, and a supercharger design so clever it still makes engineers smile today. So let's begin. But first, what exactly made these two engines so different? Now, to understand why the Merlin mattered, you need to understand what pilots actually needed in 1940. And I mean really needed, not what looked good on paper. See, aerial combat at the time was evolving faster than anyone could have predicted. The days of biplanes circling each other at 10,000 feet were over. Fighters were climbing higher, diving faster, and engaging at altitudes that would have seemed impossible just a decade earlier. The Allison V-1710 was a perfectly good engine. I want to be clear about that. It was reliable, relatively simple to manufacture, and it worked. The Americans had been developing it since the early 1930s, and by the time war broke out, it was powering everything from the P-38 Lightning to the P-40 Warhawk to early versions of the P-51 Mustang. On paper, it made sense. Around 1,200 horsepower, liquid-cooled, 12 cylinders in a V configuration. Solid engineering. But here's the thing. The Allison had a problem. And that problem had everything to do with altitude. The V-1710 used a single-stage, single-speed supercharger. Now, I realize that sounds like technical jargon, so let me explain why it matters. A supercharger is basically a pump that forces more air into the engine than it would naturally get. More air means more fuel can be burned, which means more power. Simple enough, right? The issue is that air gets thinner as you climb. At sea level, the atmosphere is dense, and the supercharger doesn't have to work very hard. But at 20,000 feet, the air is so thin that the engine starts gasping for breath. The Allison's single-stage supercharger just couldn't keep up. Below 15,000 feet, the P-40 was a capable fighter. Above that, it started losing power rapidly. And guess where the Luftwaffe preferred to fight? Yeah, high altitude. The Rolls-Royce Merlin took a completely different approach. The British had been obsessed with high-altitude performance ever since the Schneider Trophy races of the 1920s and 1930s, where seaplanes competed for speed records at increasingly ridiculous velocities. Those races taught Rolls-Royce engineers something crucial, that the engine that won at altitude would win the war. The Merlin used a two-speed, single-stage supercharger, and later versions used a two-stage supercharger with an intercooler. I know more jargon, but this is important, so stay with me. The two-speed system meant pilots could switch between a low gear for lower altitudes and a high gear for thin air. The two-stage system meant the air was compressed twice before entering the cylinders, and the intercooler cooled that compressed air down, making it denser, which meant even more power. The result was an engine that maintained its strength at 25,000 feet, even 30,000 feet. While the Allison was wheezing, the Merlin was still breathing easy. I mention this because the technical difference translated directly into survival rates. Pilots noticed. They noticed very quickly. When American volunteer pilots joined the Royal Air Force's Eagle squadrons before the United States entered the war, they got their first taste of Merlin-powered Spitfires and Hurricanes. These men had trained on American aircraft. They knew what the P-40 could do, and suddenly they were flying something that felt like a different species entirely. One pilot described it as the difference between driving a truck and driving a sports car. The Spitfire climbed like it wanted to reach the sun. It maneuvered like it was reading your thoughts. And when the Messerschmitts came down from high altitude, you could meet them on equal terms instead of clawing desperately for height you couldn't reach. Word spread. Pilots talk. And what they were saying was simple. The British engine was better. But here's where it gets really interesting, because the Americans had a fighter airframe that was, in many ways, superior to anything the British had. The P-51 Mustang was designed by North American Aviation in an astonishing 117 days, a response to a British request for a new fighter. The airframe was revolutionary. Laminar flow wings that reduced drag, a fuselage designed for speed, and enough internal space for serious fuel capacity. There was just one problem. When the first Mustangs arrived in England in late 1941, they were powered by the Allison V-1710, and at high altitude, they were disappointing. Below 15,000 feet, the early Mustang was fast and nimble. Above that, it became just another airplane struggling against the physics of thin air. The British looked at this situation and saw an obvious solution. Take the American airframe, put the British engine in it, see what happens. This was not a straightforward swap. The Merlin was physically different from the Allison. Different dimensions, different weight distribution, different cooling requirements. Engineers at Rolls-Royce and later at Packard, which was licensed to build Merlins in America, had to redesign the engine mounts, reconfigure the cooling system, and modify the airframe to accommodate the new power plant. The first Merlin-powered Mustang flew in October 1942, and the results were, honestly, kind of insane. The P-51B, as the Merlin Mustang came to be known, could reach 440 miles per hour at 30,000 feet. It could climb to that altitude in under 7 minutes. It had the range to escort bombers all the way to Berlin and back. It was, quite simply, the best piston engine fighter of the war. Some would argue the best ever built. The difference was the engine. The same airframe with the Allison had been good. With the Merlin, it was legendary. Now, I should mention that the Americans weren't ignorant or arrogant. They recognized what they were seeing. The Army Air Forces conducted extensive comparative tests between Allison-powered and Merlin-powered Mustangs, and the results were unambiguous. At high altitude, the Merlin version was faster, climbed better, and maintained power where the Allison version fell off. The decision was made to switch production entirely to Merlin-powered variants. Packard's factory in Detroit ramped up Merlin production to meet demand. By war's end, Packard had built nearly 55,000 Merlin engines under license, more than Rolls-Royce produced in Britain. American industrial might combined with British engineering genius. That's what won the air war over Europe. But anyway, let's talk about what this actually meant for the pilots, because the numbers only tell part of the story. Lieutenant Colonel James Goodson flew both types of Mustang during his time with the 4th Fighter Group. He later wrote that the transition from the Allison to the Merlin version felt like someone had unlocked capabilities the airplane always had, but couldn't access. The P-51B wanted to climb. The P-51A had to be forced. Think about what that meant in combat. You're in a dogfight at 20,000 feet. A Messerschmitt Bf-109 is diving on your formation from above. In an Allison-powered fighter, your options are limited. You can dive away. Losing altitude you might not be able to regain. You can try to turn, but if your opponent keeps his energy up, he'll come around again with the advantage. You're reactive, not proactive. In a Merlin-powered Mustang, you can choose to climb. You can meet the threat head-on. You can pursue a diving enemy without worrying that you won't have the power to regain your altitude. You're proactive. You dictate the terms of the engagement. That psychological shift mattered as much as the technical specifications. Pilots who feel confident in their equipment fight better. Period. If you've made it this far, you're probably into this kind of stuff. Quick question, where are you watching from? Drop it in the comments, and hey, subscribe if you haven't. We do this every week. All right, let's get back to the engines. The story of the Merlin's superiority wasn't just about superchargers, although that was the biggest factor. There were other details that added up. The Merlin's construction quality was exceptional. Rolls-Royce had a reputation for precision that dated back to their luxury automobile days. And that precision translated into engines that ran smoother, lasted longer, and tolerated abuse better than they had any right to. The manufacturing tolerances on Merlin components were tight enough that parts from different factories could be mixed and matched without issues. This sounds like a minor detail, but in wartime, when you're cannibalizing wrecked aircraft to keep others flying, interchangeability is everything. A Merlin built in Manchester could accept a replacement cylinder head from a Packard factory in Detroit, and it would fit perfectly. That kind of standardization saved lives. The Merlin also benefited from continuous development throughout the war. The early Merlin IIs and the IIIs that powered the Hurricanes and Spitfires of the Battle of Britain produced around 1,000 horsepower. By 1944, the Merlin 66 was producing over 1,300 horsepower. Same basic architecture, same cylinder dimensions, but refined and boosted to extract every possible ounce of performance. The Allison did improve over the course of the war, to be fair. Later versions addressed some of the altitude limitations, and the engine continued to serve well in aircraft designed for low-altitude work like the P-38 Lightning. The P-38, with its twin turbocharged Allisons, was actually quite effective at high altitude because the turbochargers compensated for what the engines lacked. But that required a completely different airframe, one designed around two engines instead of one. For single-engine fighters, the Merlin was simply in a different league. Here's something I find fascinating about this whole story. The Merlin wasn't originally designed for fighters. Rolls-Royce developed it in the early 1930s as a power plant for bombers and civilian aircraft. The Merlin first flew in 1933 in the Hawker Hart, a biplane bomber that looks absurdly antiquated by World War II standards. Nobody at Rolls-Royce was thinking about Spitfires yet, but they were thinking about the future. The engine was designed with growth potential in mind. The basic architecture could handle more boost, more RPM, more power. That forward-thinking approach paid enormous dividends when the demands of wartime pushed engine performance requirements far beyond anything peacetime planners had imagined. The Allison, by contrast, was designed in a different environment with different assumptions. American military aviation in the 1930s wasn't focused on high-altitude interception. The strategic situation was different. America's potential enemies in that era were Japan, and to a lesser extent, various European powers that seemed far away. The Pacific Theater, where much of the eventual fighting would occur, featured a lot of lower-altitude combat over water. The Allison was adequate for those scenarios. But when American pilots found themselves fighting over Northern Europe, escorting B-17s to targets deep in Germany, the game changed, and the Allison wasn't built for that game. Now, I could spend a long time on the politics of how the Merlin Mustang marriage came about, but I'll give you the short version. It required overcoming significant institutional resistance. The Army Air Forces initially wanted to keep using American engines in American planes. There was national pride involved, and there were also practical concerns about supply chains and manufacturing capacity. What tipped the scales was simple performance data. When you put the two aircraft side by side and ran the numbers, the argument for the Merlin became impossible to ignore. Sometimes reality trumps politics. This was one of those times. The British, for their part, were eager to help. They were fighting for survival, and anything that put more capable fighters in the air over Europe was worth pursuing. Rolls-Royce shared technical data freely with Packard. British engineers traveled to America to assist with production setup. It was genuine cooperation, born of genuine necessity. And what of the Allison Company? They continued producing engines throughout the war, and the V-1710 remained important. The P-38 Lightning used it until the very end. The P-39 Era Cobra, which was mostly used by Soviet pilots through Lend-Lease, was Allison-powered. The P-63 King Cobra as well. These weren't bad aircraft. The P-38 especially was a formidable machine in the Pacific and Mediterranean theaters, but none of them achieved the legendary status of the Merlin Mustang. None of them escorted bombers to Berlin. None of them turned the tide of the air war over Europe. The pilots who flew both types were the most eloquent advocates for the Merlin. Men like Don Blakesley, who commanded the 4th Fighter Group and insisted on transition to Merlin Mustangs as quickly as possible. Men like Bud Anderson, who flew a P-51B named Old Crow and became one of the top American aces. These weren't theoretical arguments about engineering specifications. These were combat pilots stating plainly that one engine gave them a better chance of coming home alive. There's a quote I love from a pilot whose name I unfortunately can't verify, but it captures the sentiment perfectly. He said something to the effect of, "The Allison would get you to the fight. The Merlin would get you home from it." That's not entirely fair to the Allison, which was plenty reliable, but it captures the altitude advantage in visceral terms. The legacy of this engineering rivalry extended far beyond the war itself. Rolls-Royce emerged from the conflict as one of the premier aero engine manufacturers in the world, a reputation they leveraged into the jet age. The company's jet engines would power British, American, and Allied aircraft for decades to come. The Merlin's success established a standard of excellence that became part of Rolls-Royce's corporate identity. Allison, meanwhile, was acquired by General Motors in 1929 and remained part of that industrial giant. The company continued producing aircraft engines and eventually transitioned to turbines and helicopter engines. They remained important, but the V-1710's limitations at high altitude became a footnote in aviation history, a reminder that good enough isn't always good enough. The Merlin itself continued flying after the war in various roles. Surplus Merlins powered racing aircraft that set speed records in the late 1940s and 1950s. The engine's reliability and tunability made it ideal for air racing, where pilots pushed machinery to its absolute limits. Even today, restored Spitfires and Mustangs with original or rebuilt Merlins fly at air shows around the world, their distinctive sound immediately recognizable to anyone who's heard it once. And what of the aircraft these engines powered? The Spitfire became a symbol of British resistance, perhaps the most iconic fighter of the war. The Merlin-powered variants, especially the Minka 9 and Minka 14th, were the definitive versions, the ones that people picture when they think of Spitfires. The Hurricane, often overlooked in favor of its prettier sibling, did most of the heavy lifting in the Battle of Britain while also carrying Merlins in its nose. The Mustang became America's signature fighter of the European War. More than any other aircraft, it enabled the strategic bombing campaign that crippled German industry. Without the Merlin, that campaign might have ground to a halt in 1943 when bomber losses became unsustainable. With the Merlin, the bombers got through. It's worth noting that the Germans understood what they were facing. Captured Merlins were analyzed carefully by Luftwaffe engineers who recognized the supercharger design as the key to its performance. German engines improved throughout the war, and the Daimler-Benz DB605 and BMW 801 were formidable power plants. But German industry was being bombed constantly, and the kind of sustained development that Rolls-Royce achieved became impossible under those conditions. There's a certain irony in the fact that the bombing campaign made possible by the Merlin helped ensure that no German engine could fully match it. The Merlin was both sword and shield, enabling the offensive while denying the enemy the industrial capacity to counter it. So what's the takeaway from all this? I think it's that engineering excellence matters in ways that aren't always obvious until the crucial moment arrives. The Merlin wasn't designed for the specific challenges of World War II air combat. It was designed to be adaptable, reliable, and capable of growth. When circumstances demanded more, the engine had more to give. The Americans, for their part, showed admirable pragmatism. When it became clear that British engineering had produced a superior solution, they adopted it rather than insisting on homegrown alternatives. That willingness to recognize excellence wherever it originated was a strength, not a weakness. The pilots who demanded Merlin engines weren't being unpatriotic. They were being practical. They understood that survival depended on having the best available tools, regardless of national origin. And in the crucible of combat, they were proven absolutely right. The Rolls-Royce Merlin didn't win the war single-handedly. No single piece of technology ever does. But it tilted the odds in crucial ways at crucial moments. It gave Allied pilots confidence. It gave planners options. It gave factories on both sides of the Atlantic a shared goal that transcended national boundaries. And that's the story of the Rolls-Royce Merlin engine, and how British engineering outsmarted American alternatives to dominate the skies over Europe. Subscribe if you want more stories like this, and let me know in the comments what you thought. Take care, and I'll see you in the next one.